Florida. It's an angler's paradise.
Florida likes to think that we are the sport fish capital of the world.
The value of recreational fisheries in Florida overall is around $12 billion a year.
Tarpon and snook are two of the prized game fish the Sunshine State is famous for.
There's a couple reasons that tarpon are so enticing. One is their massive size. They can grow upwards to 250 pounds, almost over 7 feet long.
It's a fish that migrates great distances. They live for a really long time.
He's big, he jumps. It's kind of like almost the perfect fish.
The adrenaline rush of it just really makes it super exciting and a lot of fun.
The great thing about snook is that they're ambush predators. So no matter what you're using to fish, you're gonna see a show.
You got him, yes.
It's so much fun to catch a snook. You'll see the bite, and then they'll be airborne, just like a tarpon.
Without them, Florida wouldn't be the same.
When they're young, both tarpon and snook rely on murky, mangrove-lined tidal creeks and backcountry ponds.
I would call them essential fish habitat.
Clearly, as more and more people come here and it gets more and more developed, these kind of areas are going away.
Mangrove forests are inhospitable to humans, and with nearly 1,000 people moving to Florida every day, many have given way to coastal development.
The biggest threats to coastal fisheries are habitat loss and degradation.
Even with snook and tarpon being mostly catch and release, we're still seeing declines. What that tells us is it's much more than people fishing.
Habitat is absolutely crucial.
How do scientists study the environment juvenile snook and tarpon need to thrive? And can habitat restoration help ensure the future of the fisheries?